For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up. Season 2, Episode 55 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Our coverage of the first 3 days of the 2021 Digital Liver Meeting starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
What they wanted to do was see, can we actually achieve this in real care, which I thought was a good one because we put them into guidelines, but how often do we achieve it? What I did was take their figures and do an intention to treat analysis of that. So when you look at it on the whole groups that were done, 29% achieved more than 5% weight loss and 12% achieved 10%, which again is still a great outcome.
You said it very eloquently that funding is the main issue. I see patients with NASH. I want them to see a dietitian once a month, but they only get 2 visits a year if they have type 2 diabetes. I want them to have access to some of the weight loss apps that rely on cognitive behavioral therapy, such as Naim, but they are expensive and they're not covered by insurance.
Why are we suddenly thinking about the microbiome? And it comes back to AI and big data, because now we have the power to actually sequence bacteria and really start to characterize it. So given these observations that the microbiome somehow changes, it really begs the question, but how? What is communication between altered bugs in our gut and the behavior of the liver? We don't know the answer to that yet, but a couple of abstracts that I've just cited start to at least chip away at elements of that question.
I chose to discuss this because we need more and more data as much as we can to understand the relationship between imaging biomarkers and events as we try to replace biopsy in trying to find ways of assessing people's risk.
When I first came to work with Donna at GLI, part of what was appealing about it was not only that she was a 30-year transplant recipient, but also uniquely that she was a woman of color and that it offered the opportunity to be able to see through that lens. One was when she was at an FDA advisory council meeting early on that a doctor turned and questioned why patients were necessary. The question that she was asked was, why are you even here? And she quotes that she's used to it as a Black woman from her lived experience, but her answer was, I'm here to answer with excellence.
And the problem for aldafermin is it might not have been quite good enough to live at either end of the frontier. It has side effects, it's not oral, but it doesn't have the cleanly consistent positive result that appears so far to be showing up with a Kiro or Bio-89. That's the whole history of the pharmaceutical market, everywhere. Once you get drugs that work, drugs that would have been good enough before aren't.
This weekend, thousands of stakeholders from across the global hepatology community have convened virtually for the Digital Liver Meeting 2021, a 4-day event with well over 100 sessions on a broad range of liver-related topics. Join hepatology researchers and key opinion leaders, Dr. Scott Friedman, Michelle Long, and Naim Alkhouri, Global Liver Institute Director of Global NASH Programs Jeff McIntyre, Liver Wellness Advocate Louise Campbell, and Pricing and Forecasting Guru Roger Green as they review some of the important posters, presentations, and general discussions taking place around the first 3 days of the Digital Liver Meeting, today on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
So I speak for myself in saying, what a fantastic 3 days. It doesn't really matter where you fit in the universe of fatty liver stakeholders. There's been something really special here for you. Before we actually get started today, I want to apologize in case you hear a lot of hiss on my line. We've heard a half an hour trying to get rid of that. But what I really want to do is I want to congratulate our friend and sometimes bandmate Donna Cryer for being recognized with the first ever AASLD Distinguished Advocacy Service Award. Frankly, the AASLD's commitment to patients and to communicating to patients has been one of the really exciting and fantastic features of this year's meeting. And while I don't think any one individual owns that, I do believe that Donna's advocacy since 2014 has had a bunch to do with how we got there. In fact, we'll be talking in this program around some of the patient-focused sessions, including Donna's 9 a.m. session this morning that she conducted in a Peloton work shirt, although, of course, there was a point to that. So, Donna, congrats. Now, longtime listeners know that you can't cover a meeting of this complexity in a single episode or even 2 or 3 podcast episodes. Normally, our first same-day session would have been yesterday, but so much of yesterday was devoted to the NASH and NAFLD postgrad course, made it challenging to orchestrate. So we're here this evening, and we'll be here again tomorrow. We'll have 6 people with us each night, and we'll be discussing some of the major presentations and themes of the meeting. Most of what we cover today was presented today, but some of them will be things that came yesterday or Friday, and that's fine as well. Basic format's pretty simple. I will introduce our panelists in a moment, but between us, we've chosen up to a dozen papers or presentations or posters that we might want to cover. And if you're in the live audience, I'm wondering if that's what the issue is. If you're in the live audience, then, and live audience says we're all fine. Okay. Okay, if you're in a live audience, then come in at any point in time you've got a question, and to the best of our ability, we will come in and answer you, and keep going from there. With that, let me introduce our panelists and our groundbreaker question all at once, last name alphabetical order. First of all, Dr. Naim Alkhouri from the Arizona Liver Institute. Naim, how are you this evening?
I'm good. How are you, Roger? It's been an exciting meeting so far.
It's been a great meeting, and if I can get over this hissy fit, I'll be fantastic. Thank you. Here's our two-part groundbreaker question. Naim gets this first. Number one, what one word or brief phrase describes how you feel about this meeting so far?
I don't know, artificial intelligence, I guess. This is how I feel about this meeting. There's a lot of talk about AI, machine learning, and a lot of excitement in NASH. I think this is, relatively a quiet meeting. I think it's the calm before the storm. I think next year it's going to be a big bang in NASH with the anticipated results of the Maestro trial, and then potentially also some new data from Intercept, but I think this is an exciting meeting, although a little bit quiet.
Okay, so the other question was, what's the most powerful single moment or presentation you've witnessed over the past 3 days?
There's so much, going on, but I was excited to see some data from the NIMBLE consortium. There's the presentation today by Dr. Sanyal. I like that, they're doing everything in a very thoughtful way, context of use, focusing on having good representation of every fibrosis stage, realizing that you cannot translate these data into different populations. So I think, the way they're conducting the research is very impressive, and I look forward to seeing more. They presented data on the serologic biomarkers. Hopefully next meeting we'll see more on imaging biomarkers, but this was exciting for me.
Okay, that's great. Next, our weekend colleague, Louise Campbell. Hey, Louise, thanks for coming with us so late in your schedule. What is it, 11:40 there or something right now?
Yeah, nearly midnight. I'm going to change into a mouse or whatever it is at midnight. Either that or I'm going to lose one of my slippers.
Now, my computer already turned into a pumpkin, so I'm one ahead of you on this. At any rate, word or brief phrase describing how you feel about this meeting so far?
Tired, but more because of the timings, but... And I suppose that what's interested me about the meeting has been an awful lot of talk about adding non-invasive diagnostics to blood scores, like MRE to blood markers and things like that. So there's been more of that. So I've been interested to listen to and learn more about that, which is good. So whilst Naim thinks it's the calm before the storm, I think we're filling in the calm with other ways.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. One particular moment or presentation that grabbed you?
Obviously, Donna getting her award. There were some interesting photos from the past. But I think the MRE adding blood-based biomarkers to it to increase the sensitivity in the higher scores. And there was one with MRI, PDF, FF, and MRE, plus some others. So I'm sure Michelle will be interested in will be able to comment on that. But I suppose that one, I wasn't expecting it when I was listening to it, so it just grabbed my attention. So I suppose that one stood out for me.
Okay, great. Now, next, Dr. Scott Friedman. Scott, how are you this evening?
I'm great, Roger.
So Scott spent today coming back from the North Fork of Long Island, where Michelle Long, Michelle Duskonex actually grew up. And I'm also Long Island. So Long Island is kind of, Long Island, a small little island east of Manhattan, and is kind of dominating, or at least has a significant role to play in this evening's proceedings. Scott, one word or phrase capturing how you feel about the meeting so far?
Well, I think scientifically single-cell analysis, the idea that you can now decipher the genome of individual cells, it's really a game changer scientifically, and I think will translate into a whole lot of new great science.
And a specific moment in this presentation that really grabbed you?
I'm partial to the Distinguished Awards. Louise mentioned it for Donna, but I'm good friends with all the 4 awardees: Ray Shanazi, Donna Cryer, John Vierling and Keith Lindor. They're all exceptional human beings. There was a flurry of emails that went back and forth. I actually had the honor of introducing John Vierling's award, and there was a flurry of emails that went back amongst the presenters and the awardees, really mostly just embracing one another as best you can do with email and Zoom and text. And I guess the final word I would say about the meeting is a little bittersweet, because I think certainly we all miss the in-person meeting. And although in some ways disseminating information and acquiring information is easier in a digital format, there's no question that what makes the liver meeting really special is the buzz. When there's a hot presentation, word starts to spread around, people are in the room if something astounding is presented. All of that we're not really capturing, and nor could we. I think the organizers are doing a fantastic job compensating for the fact that we're not meeting in person, but I think we all miss it.
Okay. So then next, Michelle. Michelle Long, how are you this evening?
I'm great. I'm still sort of recovering from the fact that Scott knows about my town where I grew up, where there's literally one traffic light. So it's very surprising.
One traffic light and soon to be a 40-room hotel. That feels like where I live. It's not a good thing.
Yeah.
Not a good thing at all. Okay. So Michelle, what's your one word or phrase for the meeting?
I think it's a big step up from last year, in terms of a digital platform. I think that it seems like there's a lot more engagement of members at all of the sessions. And I've just been impressed by the amount of content at really all levels. I'm completely behind, and we'll be spending weeks kind of listening in to presentations.
Yeah, I'm in the same place you are on that one, absolutely. And then Jeff McIntyre, Director of Global NASH Programs for the Global Liver Institute. Jeff, how are you this evening?
I'm good, Roger. It's good to be here.
Great. One word or phrase from the meeting so far?
It's amazing. That's the word, amazing. I know there is a out of favor comedian that once said that, everything's amazing and nobody's paying attention to it. But, engaging this meeting, I'm in my apartment here in Maryland, listening to an epidemiologist from Myanmar talk about nutrition, with a researcher from Penn State, with patients, and providers from across the United States and Europe and Canada and Latin America. I think it's amazing to me that we can take a moment to step back and really realize how brilliant the technology is, not just in terms of keeping us all together in kind of whatever pandemic stage that we're in right now, but also the technology that we're talking about. To, shout out to what Scott just said, that, single cell analysis to artificial intelligence to also kind of having better understandings of standards of care. I mean, everything is amazing. And frankly, what a great time to be great time of hope and innovation to be alive for this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then a presentation or a moment that really got your attention, really struck you.
Well, I'm going to be the homer and talk about, my boss, Donna, and her award. But since it's already been brought up, and I'll probably come back to that, I want to mention that in one of the presentations I attended today, they talked about 9/11 liver, which I wasn't as familiar with. And it was just really humbling to hear a first responder and talk about how, the first responders, especially the World Trade Center first responders, are developing liver disease at 4 times the rate of the national population or the regular population. And this individual was already progressing from F3 to F4 NASH as well. And it's not being addressed by the policy work that's out there trying to help first responders in that area. And so it's just incredibly humbling to see it. It was something I wasn't aware of, and to have it come at us from that perspective.
Not completely surprising for those of us who know how Jeff and I connect, that you would have stolen or gotten right ahead of my line on that. My word was complexity, because I think that at a whole bunch of meetings, a whole bunch of levels, more information is being shared at a more granular level from more different directions. And I take Naim's point, which is that if what you're really about is massive breakthroughs in patient treatment, that will wait for drugs. But in terms of all the different levels on which you can look at or understand the nuances of the disease and the different perspectives through which people look at it, the richness here has been phenomenal. And I'm cruising along, listening to this session on determinants of NAFLD and NASH, and walking into an environmental presentation that just smacked the stuffing out of me. And it's the one you're talking about, right? Realizing all the environmental effects that you'd never even think about it if you didn't know to think about, right? And I've been talking to people, in this community weekly for the last 2.5 years, daily probably for the last 2.5 years, and no one has ever used the word environmental today. And all of a sudden, oh my gosh, look what we're missing. So, which speaks to a whole bunch of things at once, right? Ranging from the complexity of the issues to the how much has been unexplored and remains to be, right? So with that, and thanking the folks who are in our audience tonight, welcome. If you have questions, I've got my chat open, so if you have one, I'll see it coming, and we can figure out how to address it then. Let me just start alphabetical order again. Naim submitted 2 different papers he thought he might, or one paper and one poster, I guess he thought he might want to address. Why don't you pick one of them and take a few minutes, walk us through what's in the data, and then why you think it matters.
Yeah, of course, my pleasure. And since you're giving me the option, I guess I'll pick my presentation that I did yesterday, the oral presentation abstract 44. And this was looking at the prevalence of alcohol-associated fatty liver disease and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in a special population we call adolescents and young adults, or the AYA population. And this is now in the medical literature, it's agreed upon that it's individuals between the ages of 15 years to 39. So we utilized a national database called the NHANES database to assess the prevalence of fatty liver disease from alcohol, but also from obesity and metabolic syndrome. And we suspected that we're going to see, high prevalence because things are actually getting worse because of increased rates of alcohol consumption, especially with the COVID pandemic, and also increased rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes. Now, there are previous studies that looked at the prevalence of NAFLD in this population, but they utilized things like AST, ALT, liver ultrasound, so no direct measures of liver fat and fibrosis. So we thought that we have an opportunity within the NHANES database, because in the 2017 to 2018 cycle, they actually did FibroScans on all the participants, or a good percentage of the participants. So they did the usual physical exam, questionnaires, labs, but they also included FibroScan. So we looked at the AYA population, and then we looked at certain questionnaires that assessed the amount of alcohol consumption to divide the population into those that consumed significant amount of alcohol that will qualify them for alcohol-associated liver disease, and then those that did not consume too much alcohol to assess the prevalence of NAFLD. So we started with the entire cohort. We excluded patients with hepatitis C, very high AST, ALT levels, pregnant individuals, etc. And then we ended up with a sample size of 1,319 individuals that had FibroScan that were in the AYA cohort. And let's start first looking at the prevalence of alcohol-associated liver disease. So in those that consume too much alcohol, we found evidence of fatty liver disease in 52%, and this is based on the CAP score from the FibroScan. And then when we looked at the prevalence of significant fibrosis in this cohort, we found that 12% have evidence of F2 or higher. Liver disease in these young adults that consume too much alcohol was very prevalent, and 12% had evidence of significant fibrosis. And then when we looked at individuals that didn't consume too much alcohol, we also found evidence of NAFLD in 40%. And then when we looked at significant fibrosis, that was present in 30% of the 40% with NAFLD. We noticed that individuals with NAFLD compared to those without NAFLD, they tended to be older, more likely to be male, had higher BMI, from a Hispanic ethnicity, confirming that we're actually picking up the correct patient population. And then of course they also had higher liver enzymes and higher A1C. So I think the novelty of this was that we actually used direct measures of fatty liver and liver fibrosis. We looked at fatty liver from both alcohol and NAFLD. This podcast is Surfing the NASH Tsunami. And I think there is a tsunami that is coming because of the high prevalence of liver disease in these young adults. And if you have fatty liver that starts at the age of 10, you are at risk of developing cirrhosis by the age of 30, 35, 40. And in fact, we have national data showing that we're doing more liver transplants now for NASH in young adults. It's still a small percentage, but it's coming. And I worry that we're going to see a tsunami of these very young individuals getting a liver transplant in their 30s and 40s, and then potentially needing a second liver transplant if we don't implement very aggressive lifestyle interventions, because we know that NAFLD can come back after liver transplant. And we have data showing that, some of these individuals may end up even with significant fibrosis. So this is, my first pick, I guess, and it's my own data, so I'm biased, obviously, but I wanted to share it with the audience.
So Naim, can I jump in for a sec? I think it's really important data, and I must say I still face some skepticism from people saying, come on, you guys, you make a living studying liver disease, hepatitis C was cured. You're just looking, you're casting about looking for something to keep you busy. So how do I answer those folks?
Well, I think we see the burden of NAFLD in our clinics. Every week I see patients showing up with NASH cirrhosis. They're told they have NAFLD 10, 15 years ago. They're told, don't worry about it too much, lose weight. And it's very hard to lose weight and sustain weight loss. So I think we need to raise awareness, but for any of us that work in a transplant program in a hepatology clinic, we see the true burden of this. And of course, fatty liver, I tell people it's like having high cholesterol. So most people are asymptomatic, but if you don't actually intervene in people that are at high risk of developing clinical outcomes, you're going to miss that window of opportunity. And it drives me crazy when people try to say, oh no, it's just an imaging finding, it's a lab finding, and we only need to worry about patients with NASH cirrhosis. And I'm like, this is just not what we want to do. We want to prevent NASH cirrhosis. NASH cirrhosis, to me, is an outcome that we should not wait until we get there before we try to intervene. And, more than anyone, that, the sooner you intervene, the better the outcomes are. And we have a very cheap intervention that will help, so many aspects of the disease, which is lifestyle intervention. So when we talk about intervening, we're not always talking about new drugs and fancy technologies, and we are talking about common sense, but how do we do it on a society level? So I think we need to intervene early, especially that with the adolescents and young adults developing significant liver disease. I think we're going to see more and more cirrhosis in the near future, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks.
So first, to our audience, okay, if you would like to send a question, you should have a button on the bottom of your screen that says Start Live Call-In. If you press on that button, it will come up and ask you what camera you want to use to be seen. And then you pick a camera, pick the continue button. Then you enter your name and your question, and then you say Start Live Call, at which point it will come to me. And I will let you know before we're inviting you in if we get a chance to do that. With all that, who has other questions or comments on the panel?
I have a question, Naim. Given that they were all fibroscanned and you used CAP, what CAP cutoffs did you use? I presume none of them were biopsied, so therefore we wouldn't be using the higher ones.
Yeah, excellent question, Louise. And we actually used the cutoff of 248 decibels per meter, which is on the lower end, but this was on purpose to maximize sensitivity and make sure we're not missing any cases. And actually in the abstract, we called it suspected alcohol-associated liver disease and suspected NAFLD. And, obviously we've done the analysis where you can increase the CAP to 274 or 302. And of course, you'll increase your specificity, but then you may be missing some cases. The same thing we did also for F2 and F3. We used the cutoffs that maximized sensitivity, not specificity. But again, we are doing the analysis looking at both, using lower cutoffs and higher cutoffs. But I think, the purpose is to identify at-risk individuals, and that's why we maximize sensitivity.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree with you, and I think that's what the sort of cutoff that we use for certainly people who present for wellness, and just wanting to know whether or not they've got a risk. And to be fair, what we're going to say is you can use a lifestyle earlier. As again, prevention is better than cure, and stopping the accumulation of fat at any stage is positive. Can I ask another question? Did you have any cardiovascular risk outcomes in any of these, given the ages? Were there any events?
No, I mean, the way they do enhance, it's cross-sectional. So they do these cycles, over 2 years. They just interview the subjects. They do the physical exam, the labs, and certain imaging tests. There is no longitudinal follow-up on these individuals, but, other researchers have connected the enhanced to other databases where you can look at mortality, you can look at certain cancer databases. But this was a recent cycle, 2017-18, so we don't have outcomes yet. We can do this definitely in the future, and it's a great question. We can look at cardiovascular risk factors, lipid panels. I think they had highly sensitive CRP in some of the individuals, but no outcomes.
I'd love to jump in and comment as well. I don't know if you got to hear the excellent talk by Miriam Voss in the postgrad course, but she talked about sort of the lifespan issues of fatty liver disease. In particular, I thought was fascinating the data she presented on insulin resistance in adolescents and how in late adolescence there's a sort of a physiologic insulin resistance. And if we're seeing this sort of coupled with an increase in fatty liver in that age group, perhaps, now we don't have data yet to support this, but perhaps this is the real opportunity to intervene and do an intervention on people who are in their late adolescence to potentially make a big impact, which I thought was really interesting, especially in light of your paper.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm going to say one last thing. NASH with F1 fibrosis at age 20 is a completely different entity than NASH with stage 1 fibrosis at age 80, right? If I see someone 80-year-old, I say, you're fine. Don't worry about the liver. Go live your life. At age 20, I am terrified. I don't know what to tell them. I don't understand the natural history. And, they have a good chance of progression. So age is very important in anything we do.
Yeah, great points.
Yeah. And Scott, in some ways, to me, that circles back to your original question, right? Which is that if we're talking about 20-year-olds, now we're talking about a place where we're not just looking for a disease to hunt down, but we're seeing the coming signs of the pandemic. And in those populations, people should be scared to dickens.
Yeah, no, and Naim hit the nail on the head. I was going to say the same thing. It's terrifying to imagine, a 20-year-old has all the signs of progression to something much more ominous, and it could be by their late 20s or early 30s.
Yes. So, Naim, thanks. That was a great way to kick us off. Anyone have any other questions? If not, we'll go on to Louise, who gets to go next and choose.
Well, I just think it's important to really internalize what Naim has presented. It's really important new data, and we are, confronting skeptics. And I heard it also with diabetics. So there was a presentation, it's not part of my formal list, but it was a presentation from France that reinforced the high rate of, or the high prevalence of advanced liver disease among diabetics. And yet, when we went to our diabetes practice a couple of years ago and said we'd like to do FibroScans, they said, well, our diabetics don't have liver disease. Well, it turns out 70% had abnormal FibroScans. So it's not there if you don't look for it. And as Naim said, they're asymptomatic. So you gotta ask the question. You only see what you know.
So, yeah, and to that degree, it's not, and by the way, not just in your practice, but like everywhere, So one of the statistics that you read is that endocrinologists are perfectly comfortable doing ASTs and ALTs, which they described as liver function tests as compared to liver enzymes, like a $20 jar in every endocrinologist's office in America for that one. But they do not have a disproportionate level of any other of the more specific tests in their practices. So it speaks to your point, which of course we don't have it. We're not looking for it. We don't see it. Therefore, we don't have it. And I couldn't agree more. Louise, let's move on to you. Pick a topic of the two that you gave us.
I'm going to pick up a topic of the two that supports probably a little bit more of Naim. I am going to pick a topic from Saturday, which was done by Vicky Shah. And it was an advanced practice provider pathway achieves more effective weight loss in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease patients compared to standard of care, because I think obviously we need to target the weight loss, particularly with the concerning information that Naim's just shared. But this was the parallel session on Saturday in public services and public health, and basically what they wanted to do was they were taking the AASLD guidelines, where 5 to 10% weight loss through lifestyle change or bariatric surgery is advised to prevent NAFLD progression. So they were targeting that. They also wanted to see whether or not they could achieve that with their practice. And interventions can include dietary changes, behavioural modifications, physical activity, medication, as we know. So we know that some of the clinical trials can achieve over 5% body loss in 30% of patients and 10% weight loss in more than 10% of patients. So what they wanted to do was actually see, can we actually achieve this in real care, which I thought was a good one because we put them into guidelines, but how often do we achieve it? But so what they did was they looked at weight intervention in liver disease pathway, which they embedded in hepatology in 2018. Now, they used 3 advanced practitioners, and they were all trained in obesity management courses, and the physician that was with them was trained in obesity management as well. So they then did that against the standard of care for the hepatology pathway and recruited patients to that. So what they did was recruit patients for intensive lifestyle strategies who had liver disease, they had a BMI over 25, they had a willingness to participate. So in the wild arm, what they did was have an initial consultation of an hour, followed by monthly appointments of 30 minutes for at least 6 months as the program went on. So they did retrospective chart reviews to compare the percentage weight change for the patients in both of the managed pathways. Against the managed pathway, which was wild, against standard of care. So patients chose to participate. They received intensive support. But what I didn't find there was what the normal pathway was, because I'm assuming, like the UK, not every hepatology centre works with the same pathway, so I wasn't quite clear what standard of care was and how many appointments that was, or was it just new to follow up? Did they get seen once or twice a year? So that wasn't made very clear. But so they recruited patients between November 2018 and April 2021. 83 patients attended at least 2 wild appointments in that pathway, and 30 patients received routine general hepatology pathway follows up. So the wild pathway, they had 61 patients, or 73.5% of the patients achieved a total body weight loss of 4.8%. 20 patients, or 21%, had a small weight gain of around about 1.06%, and 3 patients, or 3.6%, had no weight change. Against the routine practice, where 40% or 12 patients achieved a total body weight loss of 2.95%, 56% or 17 patients had a median weight gain of 2%, and 3%, which was one patient, had no change. So of that, they then subdivided and they looked at the patients who had weight loss in the wild teams, which was 73% of the populations, and out of that, 39.3% did lose more than 5%, and 16% lost more than 10%, which are excellent outcomes against the routine practice. 4 patients lost, which was 33%, lost 5%, and no patients lost greater than 10%. But I think if I look at those figures straight off, those are absolutely great outcomes, and it's a valid outcome. But then when I looked at randomised controlled trials, I think most of the stuff we look at there is an intention to treat. It's the total trial. So what I did was take their figures and do an intention to treat analysis of that. So when you look at it on the whole groups that were done, it dropped to 29% achieved more than 5% weight loss and 12% achieved 10%, which again is still a great outcome and really did show that they could achieve the outcome from the AASLD guidelines. It also strongly supported the fact that if you put in advanced practitioners with good training, that they got a better outcome than standard of care. No patients in routine practice lost more than 10%. So I think for me, what it did prove was that if you put in good support with patients regularly, and this was intensive once every month for those who wanted it, but there were also patients, they accepted that would be a bias, that they were patients who were willing to and volunteered to do this. So there was a set of motivation that was probably there. So you combine the two and you will get really good outcomes, what it did show. So it did achieve what it set out to do, but I would have liked to have seen some biomarkers in that. What did it do to the liver, for example? Did they have FibroScan? Did they have any biomarkers that we could look at? FIB4, FibroScan CAP. I'd have liked to have also seen a third arm looking at the intensive therapy without the level of obesity medicine to see whether or not that's a cost-effective use of training, because in the UK we will get pushback on why do they need these courses if we can't show that that was really the difference between putting in nurse specialists, because a lot of people could do that. So those were the questions it left me, but I think it did reinforce, particularly for weight loss and motivation for people, if you can put in skilled practitioners, you can achieve the outcomes that AASLD put in to ask for over 5% and 10% body weight loss. So I thought it was a good outcome that supports that we can do it in real life practice.
Louise, what was the duration of follow-up?
The duration of follow-up from the study that was published, it was only 6 months, or a minimum of 6 months. Now, they only declared that at least they had to have attended 2 appointments from what I could see in the process. So I'm fairly sure some of them would have gone all the way through. But it looks like most of the 83 patients did complete the process for write-up. But I'd also be interested in a longitudinal study as to how, or some feedback on, did they maintain that weight at a year? Because one of the biggest things that we struggle with is we can motivate patients to lose weight. But if we remove the support or they disengage, that weight goes back on. And I think if you've got an intensive set of 3 people trained with obesity management, then the questions I would ask are, how did patients put on weight? What was the structure? What was the interviewing technique like? How many were they people who disengaged? But I think I'd love to see, that was 2018 to 2021. I'd love to see the serial data on that. And over, was it short term? Was it long term? Where are we now? But I think it did support. We can achieve the AASLD guidelines. If we're going to ask for 5 to 10% body weight loss, we need to know it's achievable.
So, Louise, obviously this is a discussion we've all been kicking back and forth for the last year and a half about how much patient support do you need in a program like this to make it work, right?
For me, from a financial perspective, if I was putting that, that's why I'd like to see normal nurse practitioners doing it without obesity management courses, because I think a lot of trial nurses and trial they don't necessarily have these courses, but they achieve these outcomes. If we look at hepatitis C care, randomized controlled trials proved the best way to treat hepatitis C with interferon: intensive, good follow-up, regular intervention. And I think if I'm going to as a manager or anything like that, if I'm going to financially invest in obesity management courses, I need to know that that's going to uplift the outcome from other nurse practitioners or other skilled professionals. It's going to add something. What's the phrase Stephen uses? The juice has got to be worth the squeeze. Mm-hmm. Yeah. When we're talking about funding to get these things in, I need to look at, what am I getting? For my bang for my buck is this other one, isn't it?
Louise, I deal with this on a daily basis in my clinic, and I can tell you as a hepatologist, I mean, you said it very eloquently that funding is the main issue, and I feel like my hands are tied. I mean, if I see patients with NASH, I want them to see a dietitian once a month, as you said, but they only get 2 visits a year if they have type 2 diabetes. I want them to be able to maybe, have access to some of the digital therapeutics, some of the weight loss apps that rely on the concept of cognitive behavioral therapy, such as Naim, but they are expensive and they're not covered by insurance. Even for me, if I want to prescribe an obesity medicine, now we have, semaglutide, high dose, very effective. I can tell you that the success rate in my clinic is very low. 5 to 10%, they may get approved. Everyone else, they get denied, and it's a quick denial. I mean, it doesn't take more than a day to find out that they will not qualify for it. And this is, our biggest frustration. I feel like today in my clinic, I can do so much for NASH patients, but I'm not able to do everything I know will help them. Funding is the key.
And that's why I wonder whether or not adding metrics to this study would have enhanced it. Because if we can show that steatosis reduces by CAP, if we can do and add those metrics, then you've got a quantitative result. And I think, should we be saying that all nutritionists and dietitians in all walks use FibroScan or steatosis measures to see the outcome of their work? Because I think there's been quite a few sessions that I've attended where it's been the quality of the diet that may have changed the outcomes rather than the weight loss in some areas. And I think those small wins we can get, and if we can add metrics like these to dietitians and nutritionists around, and it becomes standardized, add a different outcome, then maybe our funding streams will be better, because we can all get it. We can see it in cardiology, we can see it in endocrinology, we can see it in rheumatology, and all of those areas that need and engage with dietitians, HIV, co-infection, places like that. One size doesn't fit all, but maybe we can add metrics to all.
It speaks to the fact that it's multidisciplinary, and you need expertise from a lot of different angles. We've just stood up a NASH Center of Excellence that hopes to address some of these disconnects between different specialties, and particularly by incorporation of dietitians. And I wonder if healthcare systems like Kaiser that are, fully integrated are going to be the first ones to recognize this actually saves them money by getting their patients to lose weight.
You would guess, right? Because they're in a better position to do the accounting than anybody else is. But that presupposes that the formula that they hit on actually saves enough money for them to feel that it's worth pursuing, which is, I think, a challenge. All right. So with that, why don't we move on to Scott?
Yeah, wait, Michelle, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something, Louise. I think that was a great presentation. And, I went to a Meet the Expert lunch or afternoon talk today on alcohol use disorder. And there was a lot of talk about motivational interviewing. Alcohol use disorder is something that really focuses on behavioral modification. And I was thinking to myself, look, I was never taught how to do this. And this really needs to be something that is taught at all levels, whether it's to our advanced practice providers, but also to our medical students. I think that it's always worth having that intervention with their patient. And this came up again in the Meet the Expert that I did with Kathleen Corey today. When you have someone in front of you, you have to do your best to make an intervention and to see what you can do to motivate to change behavior. And that's one tool. The FibroScan is actually one tool that I use in my clinic to do that. Patients really like, their liver checkup, and they like it when I put hands on patient and say, look, you're doing it. Look, your liver fat is coming down. Even though you haven't lost any weight yet, but I can tell that you've been going out for walks. I can tell that you've been swimming every day, because look at that, your liver fat's coming down. And they really, really respond to that. That's just, there's no guideline that says I should be doing a FibroScan in 6 months on my patients, but I do it as a part of the motivational interview that I'm sort of making up, but hopefully I'm doing the right way.
It was interesting because I was at that session, and what I get the advantage to do is I get the advantage to FibroScan people regularly. So all of the guidelines at the moment talk about 2 to 5 years. Now that's because we have insufficient access to FibroScan. We just don't have enough. I've got the luxury at the moment of seeing people every 1, 2, 3 months. So when they came, and one guy was particularly interesting. He'd lost significant liver fat during COVID, and then as soon as we came out of COVID in the UK, within 3 or 4 weeks, he'd gone back up in liver fat. He was binging, drinking, he was going out partying, but his stiffness shot up. But if it wasn't the fact that you do FibroScans every 3 months on this guy, you would think it was a one-off result. He's got a high thing, but it's likely inflammation. So you can see that and the pattern, and I think it is motivational. But it just, even in our alcoholic populations, once they know, they get really engaged. Oh, my liver's not cirrhotic. I can change it, because people just assume that because they drink. And I was with a mental health practitioner, and she said, you've opened my eyes. It's the fact that we assume that all of these people have got cirrhosis. Most of them didn't. They had diabetic risks or cardiac risks rather than liver. So I think, yeah, it is hugely motivational, and I don't think there's enough papers out there on the absolute motivational impact of a physical thing that you can do in point of care, unlike a biomarker.
Yeah, yes, I agree with that. And if you listen to even the dialogues that come up on this podcast, right, people talk about how inefficient are we being in the frequency that we monitor people. You know, when we talk about MRE, for example, one of the things that comes up is you don't have to monitor everybody every year. Some people you don't have to monitor for 5 years. And if you view all of this through a diagnostic prism, that makes a lot of sense. So what someone would have to do is work on the economics of motivational use, right? To get to a point where you go, no, this is a completely different set of issues. This isn't really about what's the most efficient way to maintain and make sure people aren't getting worse. It's about what's the most efficient way to use high-value information tools to help them get better or maintain or improve. I don't know how the economics of all that work. That's not what I do for a living, but I think it's where the question has to go. Because not even what you do for a living, Michelle, although I think it's a lot closer to you than it is to me. With that, why don't we move on, because we're a little behind schedule. We wanted to be on, but that's fine. Scott, go ahead.
Thanks, Roger. So I picked 2 abstracts that really make a teaching point around the microbiome. One is 1654, and the other is 1781. And by way of background, we know that the microbiome changes with progressive NASH. We also know that you can actually create NASH in a mouse by transplanting a microbiome from an obese mouse into a skinny mouse and confer, as I said, the presence of NASH, albeit in a very kind of experimental setting. And so, and we can also say, well, why are we suddenly thinking about the microbiome? And it comes back to what we started the podcast talking about, which was AI and big data, because now we have the power to actually sequence bacteria and really start to characterize them. So given these observations that the microbiome somehow changes, it really begs the question, but how? You know, what is the communication between altered bugs in our gut and the behavior of the liver? And we don't know the answer to that yet, but a couple of the abstracts that I've just cited start to at least chip away at some of those key elements of that question. So the first one is a very brief and one could say descriptive study from Silvia Sukoyan, who's in Buenos Aires. And basically what she showed is that different gene polymorphisms, in other words, a host genetics, actually influences the nature of the bacteria that grow in the gut. Now, it was not a very large study, and it's not definitive in terms of how that could translate into a risk of NASH, but it does tell us what makes sense, which is the bugs aren't sitting there in isolation. They're communicating with the host, and the way they communicate with the host depends in part on what the host genome is. And so I think this is just a little shaft of light in a not a particularly illuminated area of the microbiome to ask, how does the host genome actually influence not only the growth of bacteria, which bacteria are present, but maybe also how those bacteria influence the liver? And so we want to keep an eye on that and related studies. The second digs in a little deeper in terms of the communication. This is the abstract 1781 from a group at the University of Minnesota. And again, it's an experimental study, so this is not by any means ripe for prime time in terms of direct human disease therapies. But what they showed is that, first of all, the nature of the bacteria in the gut can influence the activity and the numbers of a particular lymphocyte population, the B cells, which of course make antibodies. And they showed that if they deplete the B cells, first of all, the animals have less NASH, and then if they deplete the receptors on T cells, another part of the immune system that responds to the B cells, that influences the severity of NASH as well. And finally, and perhaps most intriguingly, when they transplanted human NASH microbiota or a fecal microbiome transplant from a NASH person into a skinny mouse, they not only conferred NASH, but it was associated with an increase in the B cells. So, a little bit of hand waving around, what this all means. But, to me, it's beginning to develop the thread between the behavior of the microbiome and how the microbiome talks to the cells in the liver, particularly the immune cells that generate inflammation and ultimately drive fibrosis. Now, what they don't tell us is which of the bacteria are the critical ones, what do those bacteria make, is it dependent at all on how the bacteria interact with the bowel wall, and ultimately what is percolating up into the liver that changes the nature of inflammation there. So more questions than answers, but I think that NASH is a very multifactorial disease, and I think one of the challenges and maybe one of the frustrations of trying to treat it is, the whole system is jiggered to develop lots of redundancies to keep fat in the liver, to keep the patient obese, to ultimately drive forward this disease in so many ways. And it may well be that, tinkering with just one of the many elements that converge into the NASH liver is never going to be fully sufficient. It may also be that different NASH patients have different subdiseases and not the entire NASH population is exactly the same. And so we may get to the point where different patients with NASH require different treatments. But to bring us back home to the concept I started with, I think that we have a lot to learn about the microbiome. I personally believe it's very, very important. And the reason I say that is in part based on the work of Marty Blazer, who's actually an infectious disease expert, who sort of convinced me that epidemiologically, it's very hard to explain how a disease showed up on our radar screens in a 20 to 30 year period that didn't exist before. And it's certainly, our genes haven't changed over hundreds, if not thousands of years to any extent. And so something external has changed, comes back to the environment. So the environment doesn't include only 9/11 and exposure to pollutants, which can drive NASH, but also, of course, the food we eat, the fructose in our foodstuffs. And all of this really is conspiring in a way, in part to converge on the microbiome to change the disease. Of course, that's the easy answer. The hard question is, what do we do to switch the microbiome to a healthier state, and how do we keep it there, and what specifically are we trying to do to the microbiome? Those questions we're far from answering. But, I would say stay tuned. I think there are certainly a lot of companies, but there's a lot of interest in trying to fill in the gaps in this link between changing bacteria in the intestine and to a little extent in the liver itself, and how they talk to the liver and how they change the biology of the disease.
Scott, can I ask if, for those endpoints that you're looking at, you've mentioned inflammation, fibrosis, cirrhosis, and whatnot in the mice after the transfer. Would that also account for obesity? Was that one of the findings that occurred in that?
They didn't mention it. It's a really important question, Jeff, and they don't mention whether the mice got obese and whether being obese is necessary to develop the NASH picture. Don't know.
So this is fascinating because to kind of step outside of the NASH world for a second to bring something relevant in, I think it's September or October, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition brought up a point about exactly this sort of thing, but on a little bit more of a macro level, which is that traditionally that we have seen obesity as kind of an energy balance, if you will. It's calories in, calories out. But there is a new model that is being discussed within the nutrition area that's more of a carbohydrate insulin sort of model. And what it rests on is this kind of criticism that not all calories are created equal, and that it also does not account for the kind of underlying biological mechanisms that may be occurring, which I feel like is what you are describing in a lot more detail of. And you're absolutely, dead right on this, that the implications of this, not just in terms of treatment for fibrosis or inflammation are amazing, but in terms of just kind of how we make dietary choices, or how patients make dietary choices, it could be drastically revolutionary in terms of how that's approached.
Yeah, and it may well be that the bacteria actually change our dietary choices. There's a whole world now of gut-brain signaling that suggests that the bacteria in the gut actually tickle specific neuronal-like cells or enterochromatin cells that actually communicate with the brain. And so it could well be that the diet reflects the changes in the bugs as much as the changes in the bugs reflects the diet.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating model to think that traditionally that what we have focused on for nutrition, and I realize that this is a little controversial, is that overeating is the issue, period. But in fact, that there could be other mechanisms at play, whether it's in the microbiome or whether it's in the type of food that's sending certain triggers. Just even the process of obesity could be something that kind of replicates itself. You see folks that are, newly diagnosed diabetics that go onto insulin do tend to gain a little bit of weight. And that's kind of irregardless of whether they are traditionally overeating or not. This is a fascinating area to kind of dig into the details on.
Yeah, and that's before you get into questions of ways that your appetite tricks you in terms of hunger and ways that your taste buds trick you in terms of what's good or bad for you, right? Anyone who's ever had the experience of losing, say, 50 pounds in a shot, which I did do once, knows that you wind up craving fats and salts and sugars because that's what your tongue is looking for. I don't know where in the neuronal mix that fits, Scott, but I know it was very real and it was very physiological, and literally had to retrain my taste buds in order to lose and keep weight off. I assume that's somewhere in this mix.
Yeah, well, that's part of this gut, probably hypothalamic signaling primarily.
I think, and the thing that goes along with that, right, is then I forget where it was today. Everything I saw is kind of running together. But one presentation, and Louise, I thought of you immediately, talked about the idea that the average child and adolescent in the UK gets 65% of their calories from highly processed foods. And more so there than in any of the other 24 countries studied. But that immediately has to be on the wrong track for everything we're talking about, right?
It is. And it's interesting, the conversation that you're having. There was a TV program they did here. I don't know whether you guys get access to it. It's called What We're Feeding Our Children. And we have two twin doctors, Chris Van Tuken and his brother. They did one on alcohol a few years ago where they drank a week's supply in 2 days because you couldn't do it in a day, and a week's supply every day did it. And they did fibrograms before and after and showed that difference. But one of the twins this time ate fast food 3 meals a day for 28 days. And what they did was show the neurological changes that fast food and high sucrose do. And it's about the drug and stimulate the excite genes. And these neurological pathways couldn't be broken after he reversed his diet and went back to normal diet. So within 28 days, they'd shown the chemical brain. And so it does do exactly what you said, Roger. You breaking that addiction to those neurological. It was just amazing, this program of What We're Feeding Our Children. So it was a BBC program. If anybody gets access to it, it's just frightening.
Yeah, a few years ago there was I don't remember the filmmaker, but the movie was called Super Size Me. Yeah, and a guy the filmmaker actually ate nothing but McDonald's foods for a month, and he gained like 30 pounds and developed and had fiber scans and had increasing stiffness and fat. So
And that was about the time McDonald's stopped calling their biggest customers power eaters, but because it's kind of the opposite of that. Michelle, why don't we, Scott, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. It's all been fantastic so far and contributions. Michelle, why don't we move on to you? Okay.
Great. So I'd like to talk about a presentation from the Presidential Plenary this morning by Dr. Tamaki, who presented work on the longitudinal association between MRE and liver-related events and cardiovascular events in NAFLD. So this was a retrospective cohort study with about 430 participants, and they looked at MREs done at a single center in Japan, and they examined risk for HCC, decompensation, and cardiovascular disease every 1 to 6 months. And the total follow-up was just under 2 years. I think it was 1.9 months. And they defined HCC based on imaging, decompensation, the development of ascites, varices, hepatic encephalopathy, and cardiovascular disease was defined by coronary heart disease, CHF, stroke, or peripheral vascular disease. So, the sample actually reflects very typical for some of our NASH clinical trials. The mean age was about 67, half men. The BMI was 25.5, but this was in Japan. So, as you know, they have a different BMI cutoff. About 40% of overall had diabetes, 54% had dyslipidemia, and 30% with hypertension. And prevalent cardiovascular disease was present at about 4%, and 2% overall had a history of decompensation. Although, looking at the different arms, those that they had presumed cirrhosis based on an MRE of over 4.7 had a higher risk of baseline, had a higher prevalence of baseline HCC. 20% had a history of HCC, whereas those that had MRE in the moderate fibrosis range from 3 to 4.7 kPa, they had 15% with a history of HCC. So then what they did was they basically looked at these different groups based on MRE cutoff, and they defined MRE less than 3 as minimal fibrosis. And they looked at, okay, what is your risk of any of these events over this 1.9 months of follow-up? And they excluded those with prevalent disease when they looked forward. So they looked at incident HCC, and they really found that the only group that had an increased risk of incident HCC was those in the MRE cutoff of over 4.7. And they had a 10% risk of incident HCC. And then they looked at hepatic decompensation. And again, the only group that had an increased risk was the MRE score of greater than 4.7 kPa. And the risk of decompensation was 12%. And then when they looked at cardiovascular disease events, it was the moderate fibrosis, the MRE between 3 and 4.7, that had an increased risk of cardiovascular disease events of about 6%. And compared to those in the cirrhotic range of MRE of over 4.7, that was statistically significant. So they went on and did some additional analyses. They looked at MRE as a continuous variable, and they looked at, for every 1 kilopascal increase in MRE, what was your risk of HCC? And it increased about almost 40% for every 1 kilopascal increase in your MRE kPa. And similarly, your risk of hepatic decompensation increased by 30% for every 1 kPa increase in your MRE. And then they did a multivariable analysis, and they looked at various factors to see what was associated with these increased risks. And it turns out that they looked at age and sex and diabetes and some of the other cardiovascular risk factors like hypertension and dyslipidemia. And for HCC, it was the ones that were statistically significant in the multivariable model was your MRE at baseline, and I believe it was your age. And for risk of decompensation, only MRE was statistically significant as a risk factor for having that outcome of hepatic decompensation. And for the cardiovascular event, only diabetes was associated, baseline diabetes was associated with your risk of having the cardiovascular event. They did some additional analyses as well to see about the relationship, because I think it was a little surprising that the moderate fibrosis had a higher risk compared to those with more advanced fibrosis. So they did a polynomial regression, which looks for a nonlinear relationship. And in this model, they did show that the MRE increased cardiovascular risk up to KPA of about 5.5, and then the risk decreased. And so they concluded that there was a nonlinear relationship between MRE and cardiovascular disease. And overall, they concluded that MRE was associated with risk of incident HCC and risk of decompensation, and that the potential link between cardiovascular disease is more complex. So I chose to discuss this because I think it's a really important topic. I think that we need more and more data as much as we can to understand the relationship between biomarkers, imaging biomarkers, and events as we try to replace biopsy in thinking about trying to find ways of assessing people's risk. I think that the findings that MRE over 4.7 is associated with HCC and decompensation are really important. The time period that they were looking at was really short. So these patients are having events and on a relatively short time frame. So that I think is a really important clinical message. The mean MRE KPA was pretty high in this sample. It was 3.8 overall. And so, this is probably an F3 or so, F3 and above population. So that's something to keep in mind when you're translating. I think there's a lot that I'd like to read the full paper. I don't, fully understand how the retrospective cohort was done. And I worry that in those patients who are having those events, and that you're seeing that whether or not you're perhaps not recognizing or diagnosing as likely to diagnose a cardiovascular event. I think it can be confusing, especially if someone's developing ascites, for example, and one of your events that you're developing potentially is CHF. There can be some overlap and it can be confusing. So I do wonder about that. And I spend some of my time adjudicating cardiovascular endpoints for the Framingham Heart Study. And I have some knowledge of what goes into that. And I wonder to what degree that was done in this retrospective study. And then I also wonder about statin use. That was also not mentioned in this paper. We do know that in people with presumed cirrhosis at baseline had a lower LDL compared to those in the other groups. And I don't know if that's from statin use or if that just reflects something else going on with their physiology. But overall, I think a really interesting study that gives us another data point as we try to understand how our imaging biomarkers reflect outcomes.
Thanks, Michelle. That was great. Louise, help me. I'm trying to remember. Was it, or Scott Leslie? I don't think it was your session. I think it was the one after you with Alina Allen, where we literally wound up talking about the idea that once your KPA got up over a certain level, you were dealing with frank cirrhosis, and at that point, cardiovascular was likely to become less important and hepatic more. So when I listened to that paper today, I had some background that said to me, yeah, that makes sense. I don't recall exactly when it was. It was on this podcast recently. Louise, do you remember, Scott? Was it you? I think it was you. I think it was Alina, but I couldn't swear to it.
It was Alina.
Yeah, and that very well may be the case. I mean, especially, patients coming in with cirrhosis, they're starting to have decompensating events. You're really focusing in on those things. And, I don't know how they defined coronary heart disease, but that can be pretty subtle to pick up. And it's sort of the bottom problem that I'm thinking about when I'm worried about my patient who's having complications or is developing HCC.
That makes sense. I wouldn't want us to live in a world where people said, "Oh, don't worry about cardiovascular anymore." But it does seem like kind of a dynamic relationship. Other thoughts, questions, comments?
No, I mean, I think the more we have outcome data that tells us if this number gets higher, you're at risk for outcomes, the more the FDA will move away from requiring biopsy for approving drugs. That's a good thing.
Scott, to comment on what you just said, I think, we have a lot of data now showing that, several of these non-invasive tests, they actually correlate with outcomes at baseline. The issue is that the FDA is saying, okay, but now you need to show me that reduction in MRE to lower than a certain threshold will predict better outcomes, which I think is not fair, because when they actually decided to approve NASH resolution as an outcome, we had zero data showing that actually resolving NASH with a pharmacologic agent will translate into improved clinical outcomes. That data does not exist even today after all this time. The same you can say even for fibrosis. If you take someone with F2 and take them to F1, there's no data showing me that this patient will have better outcomes. So the FDA is raising the bar, and they're saying, well, okay, that's great. More than 4.7, you're going to have worse outcomes. But if you take patients from 5 to 4, this doesn't mean anything. You need to show us that actually they had less liver outcomes. And this is where we're struggling. But I think we have enough today to show that at baseline, these NITs mean something, whether it's liver stiffness on FibroScan, MRE, ELF, even FIB4. This bar that was raised on us is making it more difficult to move away from biopsy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, Naim. I couldn't agree more. And I think that, looking at this paper in particular, those that had an MRE in the 3 to 4.7, which is not low, that's a relatively high MRE range. Like, they did not have liver outcomes in this almost 2-year follow-up. So to show, and this is the sort of target population for our interventions and our drugs for most of them. So, to show an improvement in liver-related events is going to be really hard for that group if we have to prove that a reduction in MRE shows that. And then, when we use MRE in studies and we have to compare it to an imperfect gold standard, I think the cards are stacked against us.
Yeah, the more I think about it, I'm leaning toward just moving to outcomes altogether and bypassing biopsy and NITs. I know this is not conventional. This is not what we talk about in meetings. But now that we have data looking at MACE, major adverse cardiovascular events, looking at major adverse liver outcomes, the New England Journal of Medicine paper that was published from the NASH CRN showed also development of CKD, GFR less than 60. You can look at development of diabetes, development of extrahepatic cancer. I think if we put all of these in a composite endpoint, the sample size doesn't have to be thousands and thousands of people. And the duration of follow-up, as you showed in this study, doesn't have to be 15 years. I think within 5 to 6 years, we will have enough of these outcomes in a composite endpoint where you can just basically develop the drugs. And the cost, when you see how much we are, paying for MRE and PDFF and liver biopsy, if you just follow people for outcomes, I think the cost is not going to be exponentially higher.
It's a really important paper, and I'll be quick. There was a really important paper published just this month from the Gilead trials that failed, but they had 2 major trials. And despite the overall failure of the drug to show benefit, there were 16% of patients who had regression of cirrhosis. Those 16% had a dramatically reduced incidence of liver events. So there's real power to reducing fibrosis, even if in this case we didn't know quite why they got better.
Yeah, and I thank you for bringing this paper, but this is the first evidence we have, and this was only in cirrhotics.
Yes.
And it goes back to my point, taking F2 to F1, what does that mean in terms of outcomes? No one knows at this point. We think, and I agree that I think it will translate into better outcomes, but again, when you take it to the FDA, you just have to bring it up that you don't have that data. So
yeah, well, that'll take 20 years. So
yeah, exactly. But this is what they're asking us for MRE and other NITs.
I'm a little concerned that if you pump the brakes on all subpart H endpoints and wait 5 years for outcomes, that the people who went crazy that OCA didn't get approved because we need a drug. I don't think we're going to hold 5 years for that. I think the transition that you're talking about makes a lot of sense, but managing the timing and the pieces so the patients can get help in the interim and get the support they need is, I think, really going to be a trick. Timing is always the hardest thing to get right, I think.
Yeah, I just worry, Roger, that if you have a medicine like resmetirom, where you're showing reduction in liver fat, ALT, gamma GT, now we have data at the meeting showing reduction in MRE and ProC3 and ELF, and there's improvement in lipid panels, right? I mean, like the entire metabolic syndrome is being tackled with this drug. If you don't meet that primary endpoint on NASH resolution on biopsy, do we give up on a medicine like this, or do we say, let's just take it to, full outcomes? This is my worry, that we'll be losing good drugs if we don't meet these, in my mind, arbitrary endpoints.
Yeah. That makes complete sense, right? If you can get it the way it is now, take it. If you can't get it the way it is now, then what do you do? That makes complete sense. Yeah, to me at least. So before we go on to Jeff, we actually got a question in from audience on the phone, so we couldn't get this person on. Scott, the question went back to your talk, I think, and it was about the relationship between probiotics and NAFLD. And if you'd like to comment on that in the context of microbiota, or anybody else has anything they want to add on that.
Too early to make any definitive statements, in my view. And it turns out, there are a couple of companies, including one in Israel, based on very solid science, that will try to characterize the individual microbiome before they make recommendations on diet or probiotics. I think there's something to that, in that one probiotic does not fit all. I think it's just too early to make any assertive statements about which probiotics will help, and if they are helpful, it will not necessarily help all people. Important question, just too early to give you any definitive answer.
The only definitive statement I'm comfortable making about that is that whatever it says on the box of the product that they're selling over the counter probably is not accurate.
Well, that's a critical point you made. It's all of the nutraceuticals are not FDA approved, and their contents are sometimes wildly different than what is on the bottle.
Yep, fairly stated.
I don't know about probiotics per se, but certainly all the over-the-counter stuff needs to be viewed with extreme suspicion.
So, at any rate, is that a reasonable consensus for everybody? Probably something there, but too early to tell what it is or to act on it. Yay. All right, Jeff, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Roger. I am going to continue my patient hat status here of being a homer for Donna Cryer and the Global Liver Institute, which I represent. And we've all acknowledged kind of the wonderful AASLD Distinguished Advocacy Award that she received today. And I know it's a great moment. And I also know that she will not be satisfied until they actually name the award after her down the road as well, which I'll look forward to one day. And so I'm going to kind of continue along the theme there and talking about my boss with the session that she did today on grit, grace, gratitude, and resilience, what you wish your doctors knew about you. Donna would say very quickly, and did say in her opening of the session, that she really only kind of self-identifies with one of those qualities, which is the gratitude. But in my tenure with GLI, I will very quickly say that I have witnessed both the grit and the grace and the gratitude and the resilience that she's shown, and the tough customer that she can be in demanding for what patients' role is in treatment and in the development of the field as well. Her presentation, her session really speaks to kind of what the patient workload is of navigating care, which is something that we don't talk about a whole lot. When I first came to work with Donna at GLI, part of what was appealing about it was not only that she was a patient, a 30-year transplant recipient, but also uniquely that she was a woman of color, and that it offered the opportunity to be able to see through that lens, not just kind of to support how she was addressing this issue, but also kind of just how the medical and healthcare system engaged her as a liver patient. And she made a couple of points, which I'll go through here very quickly in the session today, that I think were really great for providers, for researchers, and especially for patients to be able to consider as we're addressing these issues around NASH. One was when she was at an FDA Advisory Council meeting early on, that a doctor turned and questioned why patients were necessary. The question that she was asked was, "Why are you even here?" And she quotes that she's used to it as a Black woman from her lived experience. But her answer was, I'm here to answer with excellence. And as a Georgetown and Harvard grad, I think that's something that comes pretty naturally for her, but is a fight every day to be able to do. That you have to kind of prove what the patient claims are often, that we're not believed in the field. Second one was from a boss at a PR firm that she worked for, when the boss made the statement of, "This is an emergency," when referring to a press release that needed to get out under a certain timeline. And to be able to step back and say from her own experience that, no, having blood that won't coagulate and being given basically 7 days to live without that happening, that's an emergency. And so it really professes a sense of, to me, a sense of grace, a sense of, to go back to my opening comment of everything is awesome here when we're dealing with those sort of circumstances. She was mentioned early on when she was the interim CEO of another organization that, quote unquote, your patient-centric stuff is upsetting people and you have to stop. And as someone that is a patient advocate and has often fought battles in population health and for the rights of underserved and underrepresented populations, hell no, just every voice matters and every voice has to be up there. And she realized very quickly if she was not wanted there, then that's where GLI would start, with the first patient-focused and patient-driven patient advocacy organization for the globe. She was also told that there's nothing for patients here at an FDA patient rally. But to end on more of a positive note from the session, one comes from the Advanced Advocacy Academy, which is the one that was actually done in person before the pandemic. And I was there to witness this when the patient said to her, "You've expanded my sense of what I can accomplish." And that sort of, we throw around the phrase of patient empowerment quite often. And I think it comes up when we talk about things like patient compliance, which when you talk to patients about patients' compliance, that's a pretty bad word to use of, you must comply. Instead, we want it to be patient empowered and have patients be able to really speak to their experience and to be brought along with ownership over their own treatment in that. And that academy, that A3 that GLI runs, really helps to kind of build the next generation, help to build skills, knowledge, but really importantly, also helps them build confidence in being able to engage not just the field, but to be able to engage their practitioner, to be able to engage their caregiver, and eventually down the road, hopefully, be able to engage even policymakers to be able to impact change as well. And the final thing I want to point out that she said was about our recent GLI awards, when we gave our first awards, and we gave the first award for health equity in liver health, and that went to the Black Liver Health Initiative, I believe also out of New York. And they were so appreciative. And one of the statements that they said to her that stood out for Donna is that this award will help us ask for more. And that's going to be more recognition, more confidence, more funding. And it's it's a humbling experience to sit in these sessions and to see, how one person, one organization, one field can impact so many lives so greatly. And I'll end with that positive message, Roger.
So last week we had Donna and Terry Milton on, and we were talking about the patient-focused drug development meeting. And I heard the phrase physician paternalism fall out of my mouth, and realized that Donna's impact on me had been far more substantive than I was willing to appreciate. But along those lines, the phrase that wound up getting used today was patient concordance instead of compliance. How does the group feel about that as a phrase?
Well, I'm not sure. I think it hits the spirit of it, but I think I'm not sure that a lot of patients would even understand what concordance was necessarily. Donna is... I'll go on a limb here, and Donna's incredibly privileged in her position. Georgetown and Harvard degrees. She's married to a fabulous physician. And if she has a difficult time navigating care, I can only imagine what these obstacles are going to be for individuals that are working two jobs. There maybe are single parents or somebody that doesn't have the same amount of opportunity that she is now attempting to try to spread to other people as well. And so I think it's absolutely concordance, but there's also another sense of just partnership.
I think partnership is actually a better word. I think we use concordance because we certainly use concordance in clinical trials because we moved away from compliance. It's exactly the same way that you described it. People don't like it, people don't want it, and we have to accept that people don't comply all of the time. I think we based interferon and ribavirin on 80% of the dose, 80% of the time you get. So we knew. But I think it is very difficult, but it's very difficult for us within healthcare, as we've described tonight, to navigate healthcare. We don't get the right arguments. We've got financial constraints. The whole system is set for nobody to get through it. And I think it is really, really difficult. Even with Insight recently, if ever I have to engage with healthcare, I struggle. Because you don't know the right person, you don't know the right appointments, you don't know. It's intimidating, even for people who are familiar with it. It is practically impossible. So to get people into clinical studies, we really have to make them feel comfortable in an environment which is unnatural. And I think it is really, really hard. And for those who are literate, for those who are computer savvy, it is a little bit easier. For if you're illiterate, if you are from a minority that don't speak English, it is very, very difficult in most societies. We just need to cut through it. There must be a way that we can all come together in healthcare to make it easier. Got to be an easy way through this system.
Yeah, I agree. I think the partnership is a better word. I think concordance is complicated, and I don't think my patients would understand what that means. And I think this really speaks to the physician has to understand as a partner with their patient what they're asking them to do. If you're asking your patients, sure, you can just go and preach your preach and tell them your list of things that they need to do, but if it's impossible because you had not taken a chance to understand their lives and what obstacles they're facing and really understand how their health factors into the other things that are going on with your patients, then it's not fair. And so I like the partnership because it really kind of shows more of a understanding that the physician needs to have of their patient, and similarly, the patient needs to engage with the physician and kind of agree, to do certain things and help the physician understand or provider understand what is happening and what are the barriers.
Yeah, I would call it patient buy-in. That's really what it is.
But Scott, buy-in and partnership, I think, buy-in gets closer to concordance, right? Partnership is the idea that goes, two people are two sets of interests are driving together. Compliance is you do what I say. Concordance is you align with where I am. Buy-in is close to you align with where I am. It's not you do what I say, but neither is it two sets of interests are working this out together. And I didn't love concordance. I wasn't going to start by saying I don't love this. I didn't love concordance precisely for that reason. We use language sometimes to dress up what we really mean, and in the same sense that we talk about things being differentiated because they're not really different, but we'd like you to think they are. Concordance feels to me like I don't want to tell you to comply, but we're not exactly equal here either. And I think if Donna's been about anything, it's been about, if she's been about anything, she's been about, well, the patient is either equal or in a more important position even than the provider is. Because if the patient isn't going to do it, it isn't going to matter. Nothing about us without us, right, Louise? Which Donna told us the first time she came on, and Louise proceeded to quote regularly for the next, up until about 2 months ago, maybe. Yeah, I think all that's correct. And, well, everyone here knows how we all feel about Donna and what she's accomplished and what you guys accomplish every week. So with that, let me cover, and then we'll be at about our wrap-up time, and if anyone wants to. So I would like to go back to drugs. And I would like to go back to drugs because we have this history in this disease of everything fails eventually, right? We've had no clinical successes in forever. And over time, I think people become incapable of telling the difference between a failure that says we're going on the wrong track and a failure that says we're going on the right track, we're just not far enough along yet. So we did an episode earlier this year on the press release from NGM Bio that said that they were discontinuing aldafermin for non-cirrhotic NASH. And earlier today, Harrison presented in greater detail the findings from Alpine 2-3 in the Presidential Plenary. And then we had the opportunity 3 hours later to listen to Rohit Lumba talk about some of the findings from Falcon 1-2, which is pegbalfermin. What was striking is that if all you were doing was scoring the balls and strikes, then you'd say that those were both the same thing because neither one of them was going to point to a commercial success and launch. But the differences between the two vastly outweighed the similarities. And if you want to appreciate how far we're coming, despite, and I take your point about the FDA could blow everything out of the water on biopsy and 8 other bad things could happen. But pegbalfermin is really much more typical of what we've seen, right? 1-to-1 to 1-to-1 ratio, 4 different doses, no significant numbers anywhere in the results. It was numerically better, but never statistically superior. There were no there was no dose-response relationship. There was nothing in it that could prove that this was really working, right? And 24 weeks, you got results. In 48 weeks, you didn't. That looked to me like a failure. But aldafermin's very different. You had dose-response relationships, except for one fibrosis point that stuck out, which was the 1 milligram. You had a 0.03, you had a 1, and you had a 3. Everything went in the same direction all the way through, which was extremely affirmative, except for the fibrosis measure at 1 milligram. Was the only outlier. So Stephen's conclusion was that every objective measure said the same thing, and it was a subjective measure that kind of gummed up the works. And that goes back to Naim's point about biopsy being a disaster, or I think as Scott described it a couple of weeks ago, we're yoked to biopsy. And I think that puts the appropriate burden of slavery and weightedness and heaviness on how bad a deal biopsy is at this point. I've taken to calling it the pyrite standard myself instead of an perfect gold standard, because if it's anybody's gold standard, it's only for fools. But there's a different way to look at the aldafermin results, which is that if you need a very, very fast response for patients who are late into advanced fibrosis or a compensated cirrhosis, then you need to be confident that everything lines up the same way, as it so far appears to be doing with some of the FGF21s. Not pegbalfermin, but Akero and probably Bio89 look like they're lining up that way. If what you want is a drug that will deal with all the metabolic issues and allow patients to deal for a long period of time, you'd rather have an oral agent with a lower level of side effects. So if you're coming to market in a pre-single cell world, you kind of need to pick where on that frontier you want to live. And the problem for aldafermin is it might not have been quite good enough to live at either end of the frontier. It has side effects. It's not oral. It's going to be very expensive, right? But it doesn't have the cleanly consistent positive result that appears so far to be showing up with Akero or Bio89. I look at that and I say that's the whole history of the pharmaceutical market everywhere. Once you get drugs that work, drugs that would have been good enough before aren't. And to me, I thought aldafermin should be celebrated as an intelligent commercial decision in the presence of some really impressive drugs that are about to show up. And so, oh my gosh, we've blown one more trial. And I'm not going to take the time to do it now, but I will publish it somewhere on the website. If you take these two trials and you put them next to each other, same sample sizes, basically looking at the same things, a world of difference in the result. And to me, that's about the maturing of the agents that are soon to be available to us. That if we had had something that performed like aldafermin 5 years ago, everybody would have shouted hallelujah, right? We were defending drugs that performed at a clearly inferior level to what that seems to do in this trial. So to me, it's one more source of optimism on top of everything else we're dealing with and how much progress we're making. And remember, I started out as a forecaster. I used to try to explain to people, when was something you thought was good? Was it really good? Or when you thought it was bad, was it really bad? This is pretty good. It just wasn't quite good enough in that moment. Questions, comments, accepted from anybody?
I love this, Roger. Only you can spin it this way. 2 failed trials, and this is a source of optimism. I like this. And I agree with you. I think, what you're saying is so true. And I think it has to do with the competitive landscape, that decision to discontinue aldafermin for F2, F3, because, they hit NASH resolution. I mean, not only the NITs, but even on histology. But when you have, semaglutide hitting NASH resolution in 59% with proven cardiovascular outcomes in diabetics, how do you compete with that, And it was a daily injection with aldafermin, increase in LDL, having to add statins in almost everyone. So these are all things that made them pause. They're still in, the cirrhosis landscape. So we'll see what the Alpine 4 will show us and what lessons we can learn. But to be honest with you, I mean, like with the pegbalfermin data and the fact that the response was not sustained at 48 weeks, that made me a little bit anxious for the other FGF21s. Although the signaling and the FGF, receptors they target are different, but that gave me pause a little bit. And they are still injectables. Obviously, more robust reduction in liver fat and other biomarkers, but that was a cause for concern for me.
I'll let other people comment before I say anything about that. Go ahead, Scott, Michelle, Jeff, Louise.
Well, alpha interferon looked good until the direct-acting antivirals came along, and then they were yesterday's news. And I think that's really what you're describing in the NASH landscape, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think actually, I would say alpha interferons didn't stink until the direct-acting. And then they really did stink. They weren't great in the first place. They were just much better than what we had. I agree with that. Naim, one of the ways I thought about that issue 2 ways, right? And remembering again that I'm not a scientist, right? This is all like commercial forecasting and self-taught. Number one, we've had several comments on this podcast that say that the injectable FGF21 is not a sustainable long-term therapy. Too much cost, too much side effect. But that if you want to get a fast result and get things down, and then switch over to a resmetirom or a semaglutide or a lanifibranor or other things we haven't seen yet, that's a logical progression of therapy for patients who are at F4 or F3. And the economics make sense and the treatment makes sense. So the problem with pegbalfermin is clearly fructofermin and Bio-89 drug, whose name I don't remember, are capable of producing statistically significant differences on things that matter fairly quickly, which this never did. But if it turns out that after a year or two, there's a wear-off on the effectiveness of fructofermin, if it's done its job by then, people should be back to something oral and more sustainable anyway. So that would be fine, I think. That's how markets mature. So I agree with you. I think there's pause for the reason you say, but it's not as disconcerting to me as it might have been if we didn't have other drugs. Other thoughts?
One comment, we didn't talk about this. I think if we're going to go to the trouble of doing biopsies, we've got to get rid of semi-quantitative scoring. Digital pathology is absolutely the way to go. We need to validate it, show that it's better at depicting subtle differences, and replace pathology scoring alone.
Amen. Amen.
The power of these technologies is undeniable. We just need to validate.
Circling back to where Naim started on the word AI, yeah, I think that's been the aha today that we never touched, and thank you for that. Let's do this last question going around. All right, based on what you've seen so far and what you know about tomorrow, what's the one thing that you hope that the part of the community that you touch most directly is going to take out of this meeting?
I'll jump in.
Thank you, Scott. Go ahead.
Stay the course. This is a marathon, not a sprint. It sounds trite, but there's a lot of subtle and not so subtle influence of investors who seem to have their own timeline, and it's usually too short and too impetuous. And I think that the science that we've heard about tonight and throughout the meeting is so compelling and so progressing that there's nowhere to go but continued improvement. And I think we'll all be around to see that success.
Thank you. And Scott, first of all, thanks for being here tonight. And thank you for contributions. And I couldn't agree with that more. Okay, next.
I'll jump in next. I suppose from my perspective, it's all of the things that we are now adding to FibroScan. We've got allele 3+, allele 4, FibroTest, FAST score. It's the way that we're now adding liquid biomarkers to non-invasive imaging markers to be more and more accurate. And I think that's proving, and some of the data that's coming out is really impressive with the MRE. And so just, again, I agree with Scott, stay the course, but we can see small changes now that make a difference, that motivate to continue the behaviour change. And I think people get competitive. They want to see more scores. They want to engage with the device. They just don't want a score on the door for most of them. So for me, it's the real way that it affects people when they see it.
I'll go next. So I completely agree with what you said, Louise and Scott. For me, I think it's taking care of the whole patient, recognizing NAFLD and NASH as part of the metabolic syndrome, as part of a complex of metabolic diseases. And we, a lot of us attending this meeting as hepatologists or people that primarily provide care from a liver perspective are going to be short-sighted if we only think about liver disease in our patients. And, to really take responsibility and take care of our patients holistically, and think about their cardiovascular risk, and don't assume someone else is going to do that, because you have your chance and you have your ability to make a difference in your patients' outcomes, and think beyond the liver.
And I'll stick with the stay the course concept. I think, my thing is probably stay the course in terms of drug development and make sure that you have good phase 2 data before you jump into phase 3 and have more respect for liver fibrosis. It's such a high bar that, we've seen many people think it's going to resolve in 12 weeks and 16 weeks. And there's preliminary data, but then, very small sample size and the variability with biopsy. We want to make sure that whatever we achieve is sustainable. And that data with pegbalfermin shows that, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. So stay the course, generate data. If you're going to take a drug to a cirrhosis cohort, make sure that you have some preliminary efficacy data in that specific cohort. Don't make assumptions based on F2 and F3. And taking the time, and as Scott said, even for investors, being patient and realizing that the disease burden is not changing, although maybe the timeline for drugs is not what we expected. This is a disease that will be with us for years and years to come, and we need to stay the course. One last thing I wanted to say, we talked about obesity and, the diet and how bad it is, but in all fairness, it's a great accomplishment for humanity that we have enough calories, more than we need. And this is really unprecedented if you think about it from the animal kingdom and, the way things used to be. We need to adjust to it. And, this took us by surprise. 100 years ago, starvation was a real deal, even in developed countries. And the fact now that we have more calories than we need is a big achievement, but it's backfiring, and we need to adapt to it. And that's why it's a problem that's beyond just medicine. It's really a big society problem.
Were you not at COP26? Fatty liver disease is destroying the planet. Too much food, too much this, that, the other. We can be sustainable.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I'm going to pick up on Naim's nutrition kick there at the end and say that, the thing that really has struck me that I'm looking forward to examining even more tomorrow is the prevalence, if you will, of nutrition in so many of the panels and as a priority from so many different perspectives at the meeting. For a frankly, for anybody, but especially for liver patients, nutrition, food is a therapeutic. It's a matter, when you think about therapeutics, you're thinking about which pill, at which dose, and at what time. And nutrition is really very similar to that. And granted, as Naim references, that we are at a time when we've got more calories than ever to be able to choose from. But I think we do have a recognition that there is still a big hill to climb here in terms of the appropriate nutrition, of which nutrition is good for you, if you will, or the good calories versus the bad calories in this instance. And the role of, say, exercise and physical activity, because that's kind of the partner to nutrition in this, that it's the way that the nutrition gets sucked up into the musculature and into the body often. And so I'm really encouraged by all the talk about nutrition and the challenge that we have in front of us, not just to be able to better communicate it and communicate its importance as providers and as clinicians and as patients, but also to policymakers, because as we've seen and mentioned in the panel tonight as well, that there is a real need for funding and reimbursement for being able to have dietitians reimbursed more than they are, so providers can send that over have patients connect with dietitians.
Amen. I love that. So here's my close. When we decided that we were actually going to try to make a podcast out of this about 8 weeks in, I asked myself, so what do we want to actually do here? And I wrote down 3 phrases that I thought should drive most of our programming for a while. And one of those was dynamic diagnostics, around the idea that biopsy is a disaster and we just needed to get a lot smarter about what this disease was and wasn't and how do you measure it. The second one was about development as nonlinear, about the idea that trials might fail, but if you're learning as you go along, drug development gets better and eventually succeeds. And the third was something we called respect for the liver, which was the idea that nobody appreciates all the different things that the liver does that affects what's going on in the body. And tonight, in my mind, I'm officially adding a fourth, which is it's the system, stupid, by which I mean it's not just the liver, right? It's the microbiome and it's the microbiota. And it's when is this cardiovascular and when is it hepatic and where does the brain fit into this? And do we understand that it's not just about respecting the liver, it's about respecting the integration of everything in the system and the role the liver plays. And I think this meeting has helped with that. I think it's helping in a bunch of ways. We've touched on several of them tonight. So I'm pretty excited. With that, let me say thanks to Naim and to Michelle and to Scott, who will not be with us tomorrow, and to Louise, who will be with us tomorrow if she's able to stay awake long enough. And Jeff will be with us tomorrow as well. Tomorrow, where we have Naim and Michelle and Scott, we will have Stephen Harrison will come back, and Mazen Noureddin and Michael Charlton. And we'll be talking about the rest of day 3 and day 4. So thanks all of you guys. Thanks Mike Wilson, who's going to spend the next 3 hours getting the hiss out of my microphone, and Eric Rounds, who does all the social media around this, and Buzzsprout, and Simon Says, and Riverside, and all the different apps that make all this possible. And thanks to those of you who stuck around in the audience and asked questions, and to those of you who've listened tonight. You're the reason we do all this anyway. Everybody have a great evening. Enjoy tomorrow. It looks like a fascinating program. Stay safe, surf on. See you on the podcast. There will be no business section tonight. We'll only do that at the end of the event. So that's it for now. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com and we will answer on the podcast or the website.